Hi guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the harshest chapters of the Second World War, the Eastern Front. You'll hear not just about battles, but about the quiet hours in frozen trenches, the hunger that never left, and the strength it took for ordinary Soviet soldiers to keep going day after day. This isn't a tale of medals or parades, but of survival, endurance, and the weight of endless winter. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. The Eastern Front was more than a battlefield. It was a world of extremes, where men were tested beyond what most of us can imagine. For Soviet soldiers, every day was a negotiation with nature, and with fear. Temperatures often dropped so low that rifles would freeze, boots stiffened, and breath turned instantly to frost. Food was scarce, sometimes nothing more than a chunk of black bread or thin cabbage soup, stretched among a dozen men. Sleep came in short bursts, stolen between artillery fire, often on bare ground that seemed to bite into the bones. Yet, despite this, millions endured, holding the line in conditions that could break even the strongest. Imagine standing guard at night, on the edge of a snow-covered forest. The wind cuts through your coat as if the fabric were made of paper. You shift your weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep blood flowing to your toes. Every sound in the darkness feels amplified. A distant crack of ice, the whisper of branches, the low rumble of artillery miles away. You know that if an attack comes, it could mean a sudden rush of chaos. But until then, it is only the silence, heavy and sharp. Letters from home were one of the few comforts. Soldiers clung to small scraps of paper, folded and refolded until the edges tore. A mother's words, a wife's promise, or the clumsy handwriting of a child could lift spirits in ways no rations ever could. But just as often, silence from home brought heavier burdens. The absence of news made men wonder if their families had survived the bombings, if villages had been burned, if there was still something to return to. The front was not only a place of physical suffering, but of constant uncertainty. Friendships were forged in this pressure, as soldiers depended on each other for survival. Sharing a crust of bread, offering a cigarette, or helping to carry a comrade too weak to walk, these small acts became lifelines. To endure was not simply to fight the enemy, but to fight cold, hunger, and despair together. Yet there were moments of strange calm. When the guns fell silent, the world seemed almost unreal. Snowflakes drifting down onto rusted helmets, or the quiet creak of trees bending under ice, could remind soldiers of life beyond the war. Some would carve wooden figures, hum folk songs, or scratch poems into the margins of old notebooks. In those fragile fragments of normalcy, they found the strength to face another day. The story we begin here is not about generals or strategies, but about those ordinary men who carried extraordinary weight. Their endurance on the Eastern Front stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the coldest and darkest of places, the mornings on the Eastern Front were often the hardest. A soldier would wake not because he was rested, but because the cold pressed against him until his body could no longer ignore it. The thin wool blanket barely covered his shoulders, and frost had formed along the inside of the dugout walls. The first task was always the same: to check if the rifle still worked. Many times, bolts froze overnight, and men had to warm them with their breath or by holding them close to their skin. Without a working weapon, a man was more vulnerable than the snow itself. After that came the search for food. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was usually watery porridge or black bread, so hard that knives were used to chip pieces away. Tea was a luxury, often little more than hot water colored by leaves reused too many times. But even this thin warmth was treasured, passed carefully hand to hand, steam rising into the frozen air. Hunger was constant, a dull ache that never left, sometimes sharp enough to cause dizziness. Men dreamed of meat, of butter, of meals they had once taken for granted. Conversations often turned to food, as if describing it in detail could replace the emptiness in their stomachs. Yet they ate what they were given. because there was no other choice. Marches followed, long treks across icy ground, boots crunching in rhythm. Socks were often damp, and, with each step, blisters grew. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet when supplies ran out, hoping it would be enough to ward off frostbite. Some men lost toes, others whole feet, but still they marched, because orders left no room for hesitation. The sound of boots together was strangely comforting, a reminder that no one walked alone. Enemy fire could break the monotony at any moment. The whistling of shells was a sound men never got used to, but they learned to react quickly. Dropping flat into the snow, hugging the earth as if it could shield them, they waited for the explosion to pass. Snow and dirt showered down, mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Then came silence again, heavier than before, filled with the pounding of their own hearts. It was in these silences that fear truly settled, a quiet realization of how close death had been. Rest was rare and shallow. Dugouts were cramped, air heavy with smoke from makeshift stoves. Men huddled together, not out of friendship but necessity. Bodies pressed side by side to share warmth. They whispered stories, sometimes about home, sometimes about nothing at all, just to fill the air and keep thoughts of battle at bay. Sleep was light, interrupted by nightmares or sudden orders to move. Even in dreams the war followed, turning every night into another kind of battlefield. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against them. Endless plains of snow stretched beyond sight, broken only by skeletal trees and ruined villages. Roads turned to rivers of mud during thaws, swallowing wagons whole. Rivers iced over, then cracked under weight, claiming both men and equipment. Nature offered no mercy, only obstacles demanding strength that often felt impossible to find. And yet, day after day, Soviet soldiers endured. Each morning they rose, each march they completed, each night they survived was another act of defiance against despair. They did not endure because they were unafraid, but because fear became as normal as hunger, woven into the rhythm of their existence. This was life on the front, endless, unforgiving, yet carried forward by men who refused to collapse. Life on the front was often measured not in victories, but in the smallest of routines. A soldier might wake to the muffled sound of boots outside the dugout, or the soft hiss of snow sliding from the roof. In those moments before the orders came, there was a strange peace, almost like home. Someone would strike a match, shielding the flame with cupped hands, and the smell of smoke drifted through the cold air. It was a reminder that even in war, there were still gestures of care, still human moments carved into the harsh landscape. Yet as the day unfolded, that quiet was always broken. Officers handed out assignments: fortify a trench, repair damaged wire, dig through frozen ground to expand a shelter. The work was endless, and the earth, stiff with ice, resisted every blow of the shovel. Hands cracked, nails tore and blood mixed with soil, but still they labored, because the front demanded it. No man could afford idleness. Not when survival depended on preparation. Hunger crept in with every passing hour. The thin soup distributed at midday offered little relief. Sometimes a soldier found a stray potato floating in the broth, and it felt like a gift. Cigarettes were traded like treasure, passed from hand to hand, lit and shared between 2 or 3 men. Smoke offered no nutrition, yet it gave a sense of warmth, a rhythm to steady nerves frayed by constant strain. Around them the world bore scars of endless battle. Trees stood stripped and broken, villages reduced to charred beams and collapsed roofs. Snow covered much of the destruction, softening the edges. But soldiers knew what lay beneath. Graves, shattered equipment, remnants of lives that would never return. The silence after shelling was sometimes worse than the explosions themselves. It was too still, too empty, a reminder of how fragile everything had become. At night the front seemed to breathe differently. Fires were forbidden, so men wrapped themselves tighter in coats, pulling caps low over their faces. The stars above were cold and distant, but many stared at them anyway, imagining their families doing the same. Letters were read again and again, some until the paper nearly disintegrated. A few soldiers carried tiny keepsakes, a locket, a photograph, a ribbon, and these small tokens became anchors against despair. Still, the mind could not always escape the weight of fear. Dreams brought images of charging enemy lines, of shells bursting, of comrades falling. Some men whispered prayers before sleeping, others spoke nothing at all, retreating deep inside themselves. Yet when dawn came, they rose again. The Eastern Front did not pause for grief or exhaustion. Duty called, and so they answered, each step another act of endurance, each breath proof that they had not yet been broken. When soldiers thought of home, it was not the grand memories that returned first, but the smallest ones. The sound of a kettle whistling in a quiet kitchen, the creak of a wooden floor, the way sunlight filtered through curtains on a summer morning. These images came suddenly, sometimes in the middle of a march, sometimes as a man drifted toward sleep in a frozen trench. They were both comfort and torment, reminders of what was lost and what might never be regained. The Eastern Front had a way of stripping life to its barest essentials. Warmth, food, rest. These became luxuries. To find them was a blessing, to lack them was expected. A soldier learned to endure with less, to eat slowly so hunger would not return too quickly, to walk carefully so worn boots would last a little longer. They spoke little of the future, because the future felt uncertain, a shadow beyond the next sunrise. Instead, their conversations circled around the present. Who had extra bread? Who had heard distant artillery? Who had seen the tracks of wolves in the snow? Nature was both enemy and companion. In the coldest nights, the wind whistled through ruined buildings like a living thing, filling the air with mournful voices. Wolves prowled the edges of encampments, their eyes glowing in the dark, reminding soldiers that death waited not only from bullets, but from the wilderness itself. Rivers, when frozen, offered a path across, but every step risked disaster, ice cracking beneath the weight of men and carts. Some crossings succeeded, others ended in silence as water swallowed both soldier and supplies. Yet amid this struggle, there were moments of startling beauty. Sunlight glinting off frost made the landscape shimmer, as though the world were covered in glass. In early dawn, the snow turned pink with reflected light, and for a few minutes, the front seemed far away. Some men captured these moments in journals, their handwriting cramped and hurried, trying to hold on to something gentle in a life of harshness. Others simply memorized the scenes, carrying them quietly, like a secret warmth. The bond between comrades grew stronger with each shared hardship. They leaned on one another, not only physically, but emotionally, because no man could survive alone. One soldier might give his last cigarette, another his dry socks, another a half of his ration. These gestures mattered more than orders or speeches. They were proof that even in the darkest times, humanity had not been extinguished. At the end of each day, when silence settled and only distant shells disturbed the night, men lay still and thought of what kept them moving. Some believed in victory, others in revenge, others only in the hope of seeing family again. Whatever the reason, it became the fire that carried them through another endless night on the Eastern Front. Morning often began with the heavy sound of artillery in the distance, a reminder that even if the trench seemed calm, the war never truly slept. Soldiers rose stiffly, joints aching from the cold ground, brushing frost from their coats before reaching for weapons that felt like extensions of their own bodies. Some muttered quietly, others stayed silent, saving what little energy they had. The first meal of the day was rarely enough to fill anyone. A piece of bread, sometimes moldy, sometimes frozen so hard it needed to be thawed over a small flame, and a tin cup of weak soup, if supplies had arrived. Men chewed slowly, stretching each bite, trying to trick their stomachs into believing they had eaten more. The hunger never left, it simply dulled into a constant ache that traveled with them like a shadow. Patrols were ordered daily, long marches through snow or mud, depending on the season. The land itself became an enemy. endless fields where wind cut through coats, forests where every snapping twig set nerves on edge. Boots sank deep into ground softened by thaw, or cracked against frozen soil so hard it bruised their heels. Frostbite was common, turning fingers and toes pale then black. A man who fell behind risked not only discipline but his own life, for the front line moved quickly and rarely waited. During lulls between fighting, soldiers worked tirelessly to prepare defenses. They dug trenches deeper, hauled logs, stacked sandbags, and repaired barbed wire even when hands bled and backs ached. Every task was done under the knowledge that an attack could come at any moment, that the effort put in during daylight might mean survival at night. And when the attacks did arrive, they came without mercy. The shriek of incoming shells tore through the sky, followed by thunder that shook the ground. Men pressed their faces into the dirt, clutching helmets as soil and snow rained down. When the silence returned, ears rang and hearts pounded, but orders demanded they rise and continue. Some rushed forward, others held positions, but all knew that hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Even in chaos, soldiers learned to notice small details. The smell of gunpowder mixed with earth, the way the air grew strangely still, just before artillery began again, the faint cry of wounded carried across frozen fields. They could not shut these things out, so they folded them into their existence, carrying them quietly as part of what it meant to endure. At night, when they finally returned to their dugouts, exhaustion was overwhelming. Men lay side by side, coats pulled tight, boots still on, because they might be called at any moment. Some whispered stories of villages left behind, some simply closed their eyes and let silence wash over them. The war gave no promises, but rest, however brief, was enough to gather strength for the next dawn. And so life on the Eastern Front continued, each day a mirror of the last, marked by hunger, cold, fear, and above all, a determination to survive one more sunrise. Among the most difficult challenges was the constant weight of uncertainty. Soldiers never knew when orders would come, whether to march forward into unfamiliar territory or hold their ground until reinforcements arrived. Waiting often proved harder than fighting. Hours stretched endlessly as men sat in trenches, their breath clouding in the cold air, their minds circling the same questions. Would they be attacked tonight? Would supplies arrive? Would they live to see another week? This waiting gnawed at nerves, wearing men down until even the sound of branches cracking could jolt them upright, rifles ready. Fear became a constant companion, but so too did numbness, a state where emotion dulled, where survival meant pushing feelings aside and focusing only on the next task. The body adjusted to deprivation, learning to move with less food, to sleep in short bursts, to endure cold that once felt unbearable. Yet the mind often wandered back to memories of warmth and comfort. Soldiers remembered crowded kitchens with laughter, the taste of bread still warm from the oven, the feel of sunlight on their backs as they worked fields in summer. These memories were both painful and necessary. Painful because they reminded men of what they had lost, necessary because they gave them something to cling to. In the worst moments, it was not duty or ideology that held them, but the thought of returning to even one of those ordinary moments at home. The battlefield itself carried constant reminders of loss, abandoned helmets half buried in snow, rifles leaning against ruined walls, shallow graves marked with crude wooden crosses. Every site told the story of those who had already fallen, and every soldier knew he might soon join them. Still they pressed forward, because to stop was to surrender, and surrender was unthinkable. Comradeship grew strong under such pressure. Trust was forged not in words but in actions. A man sharing his last sip of water, another carrying a comrade who could no longer walk, another standing guard longer so a friend could rest. These bonds were unspoken but powerful, giving men the strength to face each day. In letters home, soldiers often wrote little about the hardships. They spoke instead of hope, of imagined futures, of promises to return. They did not wish to burden their families with the full weight of what they endured. The truth stayed in the trenches, spoken quietly among those who lived it together. When the nights came, silence stretched wide, broken only by distant artillery, or the cry of an animal in the forest. Under the stars, men wrapped themselves in thin blankets, their rifles always within reach, and drifted into uneasy dreams. Even in sleep they could not escape the war, but they learned to gather whatever rest they could. And so, another day passed, marked not by triumph but by survival, by the quiet determination to endure one more sunrise, one more march, one more night on the endless front. The sound of boots crunching in the snow became one of the most familiar rhythms of a soldier's life. Long marches stretched for hours, sometimes for entire days, through forests, across frozen rivers, and over endless plains. The men rarely spoke during these marches. Breath steamed in the cold, and the effort of simply moving one foot ahead of the other consumed all energy. The column wound its way through landscapes scarred by war, burned villages, skeletal barns, fields where nothing grew. Horses pulled wagons laden with supplies, their flanks covered in frost, eyes dull from exhaustion. Sometimes the animals collapsed mid-march, and there was no time to stop. The wagons were unloaded, goods carried by hand, and the column pressed forward. Each step was another demand on strength, already stretched thin. Rest came in brief halts. Men dropped where they stood, some sitting on packs, others lying flat on the frozen ground, despite the cold seeping instantly into their bodies. They closed their eyes, knowing the whistle would sound soon, and the march would begin again. Hunger followed them even more relentlessly than the cold. Rations rarely kept up with demand, and soldiers learned to scrape the bottom of pots, licking the last traces of soup from their spoons. Some chewed on frozen turnips or gnawed at leather straps when food ran out, the mind desperate to trick the body. The stomach growled constantly, a reminder that endurance was as much about surviving emptiness as surviving battle. Along the roads they often saw signs of those who had gone before. Broken carts left half buried in snow, rifles abandoned in ditches, footprints that led nowhere. Each trace was a story unfinished, a silent warning that the land consumed men as surely as the fighting did. And yet they pressed forward, because the order was always to move. Nights on the march brought a different kind of trial. Men huddled together when allowed to stop, trying to light small fires shielded by blankets so the glow would not betray their position. Smoke curled upward, faint against the star-filled sky. Around these fragile flames, soldiers shared their quietest thoughts. Some hummed fragments of old songs, voices low, carrying memories of villages far away. Others simply stared into the fire, lost in the flicker of light, refusing to speak at all. The silence was heavy but shared, and in that shared silence lay a fragile comfort. Sleep was shallow, stolen in moments when the column paused for longer than an hour. Boots were never removed, rifles always within reach, coats pulled tight, even when they barely kept the wind out. Dreams blurred with waking, and men sometimes rose unsure whether they had slept at all. Dawn meant movement again, the line of men forming once more, their bodies stiff but willing, their will stronger than their weakness. And so the march continued, day after day, a slow rhythm of endurance across a land that seemed endless, carried only by determination, by habit, and by the quiet bond of those who marched side by side. Winter on the Eastern Front was not a season but a presence, a living force that pressed on every soldier with relentless weight. Snow piled high against trenches until walls threatened to collapse, and digging became an endless chore. Icicles hung from rifles and helmets, melting only briefly when men carried them close to their bodies, then freezing again in minutes. The cold was not just felt on the skin, it seeped into bones, stiffening joints, slowing thoughts, making even the simplest movement a struggle. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: old coats, ragged scarves, extra layers of shirts. Some used newspaper stuffed inside boots to block the wind. Others tore cloth into strips to bind around their hands. Yet frostbite still crept in silently, turning fingertips numb, leaving toes blackened, sometimes taking entire limbs. Men whispered of comrades who lost fingers overnight, unable to hold a rifle by morning. Fires were rare luxuries, dangerous to light because smoke betrayed positions. Instead, soldiers huddled together, pressing shoulders against one another, sharing warmth through contact as much as through clothing. Breath clouded in the cramped spaces of dugouts, freezing on walls until the wood glittered with a layer of ice. Sleep came uneasily, for the cold reached even into dreams, and many woke shivering despite layers of blankets. Food became even scarcer in winter. Supply wagons slowed in snowdrifts, and rations dwindled to the barest amounts. Frozen bread cracked teeth, thin cabbage soup froze in bowls if left too long untouched. Some men melted snow in tin cups just to trick their bodies with the feeling of fullness. Hunger weakened them further, making the cold bite deeper, every step heavier. Yet the orders still came. Hold this line. Dig new trenches, prepare for attack. The land itself seemed endless, white stretching farther than eyes could see, broken only by dark smudges of forest or the ruins of abandoned villages. Sound carried strangely in the frozen air. A single rifle shot could echo for miles, and silence felt louder than any battle. At times wolves prowled near, drawn by the scent of food or bodies. Their howls at night blended with the moan of wind, creating a chorus that unsettled even the strongest men. And yet, amid this harshness, soldiers found fleeting beauty. The sun rising over frost-covered fields painted the world in pink and gold, a vision so fragile it almost felt unreal. Snowflakes falling in stillness softened the scars of war, hiding trenches and shell craters beneath a white blanket. Some men carved figures from wood, their hands stiff but patient, shaping tiny horses or birds as tokens of another life. Others simply stood for a moment in silence, letting the sight of untouched snow remind them that there was still purity left in the world. Winter was merciless, but it was also strangely peaceful at times, and in that peace, soldiers found the strength to endure one more day, one more night, and one more breath of freezing air. Spring on the Eastern Front brought no relief, only different kinds of hardship. As snow melted, trenches filled with icy water, turning into pits of mud where boots sank deep and refused to release their grip. Soldiers worked endlessly with shovels, trying to drain the water, but the earth swallowed every effort. Clothing never dried, socks stayed damp for weeks, and skin softened until it tore easily, leaving sores that became infected. The stench of wet soil mixed with smoke and sweat, creating an air that clung to everything. Rats thrived in these conditions, bold and unafraid, crawling over sleeping men, gnawing at scraps of food, sometimes even biting through leather straps to reach crumbs. The men grew used to brushing them away, too tired to fight the invasion. With the thaw came movement, and marches through mud were even worse than those through snow. Wheels stuck, horses collapsed, men pulled wagons themselves when animals failed. Each step was a battle, as boots sank ankle deep, sucking sounds marking the rhythm of exhausted columns. The mud seemed endless, stretching across plains, swallowing villages, slowing armies until even progress of a few miles felt like victory. Hunger grew sharper as supplies lagged behind. Thin rations arrived late, and soldiers stretched what little they had by sharing, by boiling weeds into bitter stews, by chewing bark from trees when desperation was strongest. The body adjusted but never accepted. Every stomach growled, every head grew light, every hand trembled with weakness. Yet orders continued, and men obeyed, because disobedience was punished harshly, and survival meant discipline as much as endurance. Battles fought in spring were different too. Smoke from artillery clung low over wet fields, mingling with mist, turning everything into a gray blur. Visibility shrank, sounds echoed strangely in the damp air, and confusion reigned. Soldiers often advanced without knowing where the enemy truly was, guided only by shouted commands and instinct. The mud slowed movements, made retreats dangerous, and left men vulnerable to fire from above. Casualties were dragged back on makeshift sleds of wood, their bodies smeared with dirt and blood. At night, the rain continued, dripping steadily onto helmets, pattering on dugout roofs until men could hear nothing else. Sleep came lightly, if at all, broken by the constant dampness and the weight of wet blankets. Some tried to joke that the mud would swallow them before the enemy did, but laughter was weak and quickly faded. Still, amid the misery, there was stubborn resolve. Soldiers shared stories of summers past, of green fields, of rivers where they once swam. They reminded one another that beyond the mud, beyond the endless march, there was still life waiting. They clung to that hope, because without it, the weight of spring would have drowned them entirely. And so day after day they endured, boots heavy with mud, shoulders bent beneath rain, eyes fixed on the horizon that promised little, but demanded everything. Summer on the Eastern Front was deceptive. After the endless cold of winter and the drowning mud of spring, warmth might have seemed like a gift. But for soldiers, it brought its own misery. The sun beat down on open fields, turning trenches into ovens and helmets into furnaces. Sweat soaked through uniforms until fabric clung to the skin, rubbing it raw. Flies swarmed constantly, drawn to food scraps, open wounds, and the ever-present stench of bodies that could not be properly buried. Mosquitoes bred in stagnant water, rising in clouds that attacked exposed skin until men were covered in bites. Sleep became difficult, for the air inside dugouts grew suffocating, heavy with heat, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Many soldiers slept outside despite the danger, desperate for a breeze only to wake covered in insects. Water was scarce, and what little there was often carried disease. Soldiers filled canteens from rivers clouded with mud, or from wells near ruined villages, never sure if the water was safe. Dysentery spread quickly, leaving men weak and dehydrated, yet they marched on because there was no choice. Food spoiled in the heat, bread growing moldy, meat turning foul within hours. Hunger forced men to eat what they could, even when it made them ill. The land in summer seemed endless and unforgiving. Fields stretched without shade, and every movement raised dust that coated lungs and choked throats. Marches left men dizzy, sweat streaking down faces already gaunt from malnutrition. Horses collapsed under the weight of wagons, their carcasses quickly covered by flies. The smell of decay lingered in the air, impossible to escape. Battles in summer carried a different rhythm. Smoke from artillery mixed with heat haze, distorting vision, turning the horizon into a wavering blur. The sun reflected off metal, giving away positions, and sweat stung the eyes until sight faltered. Exhaustion came quicker, legs giving way not only to fear but to sheer physical collapse. Yet orders demanded movement, and men obeyed, stumbling forward even when every step felt like it might be the last. Nights offered little relief. Heat clung to the earth long after the sun set, and men tossed restlessly, unable to escape it. The silence was broken, not by the crack of frost, but by the buzzing of insects, and the faint groans of those sick from spoiled food. Some lay awake, staring at the stars, longing for the cool winds of home, remembering rivers where they once swam, imagining the shade of trees they had left behind. Still, amid the suffering, moments of strange beauty appeared. Wildflowers bloomed in places untouched by shells, their colors bright against the gray of destruction. Birds returned to forests, their songs faint but real, reminders that life went on despite the war. Soldiers noticed these things, clung to them quietly, using them as proof that there was still a world beyond the front. Summer demanded endurance of a different kind, and though it scorched and weakened, men carried on, driven not by comfort, but by the stubborn will to survive another season. Autumn on the Eastern Front arrived like a slow surrender. The heat of summer faded into chill winds, and the first yellow leaves scattered across trenches that had seen too many seasons already. At first, the change seemed welcome. The air cooler, the nights easier to bear. But soon the rains began, steady and endless, turning the land once again into a sea of mud. Boots sank with every step, wheels stuck fast, and soldiers dragged themselves forward through fields that swallowed entire columns. Clothing that had barely dried in summer now became soaked again, clinging heavy to tired bodies. The dampness never left, seeping into skin until men coughed with sickness and shivered even in daylight. The landscape transformed into a gray expanse, skies always heavy with clouds. Villages that still stood seemed abandoned by life, their roofs dripping, their chimneys silent. Fires were harder to light, wood too wet to catch, and smoke rose sluggishly in the damp air. Food, already scarce, became harder to transport, as wagons bogged down in mud, and supplies often never arrived at all. Soldiers survived on what little they had, a crust of bread, a thin soup made from roots or scraps, sometimes nothing but boiled water. Hunger sharpened again, gnawing endlessly at their insides. Nights grew colder, and though winter had not yet arrived, its breath could be felt. Mist hung low over the fields, and frost began to form on edges of helmets by morning. Men tried to dry socks by holding them near small stoves, but there were never enough flames, never enough wood, never enough warmth. Coughs echoed in dugouts, spreading quickly from man to man, each soldier too weak to fight illness fully, but too determined to stop moving. Battles fought in autumn were fought not only against the enemy, but against the mud itself. Artillery shells turned wet ground into craters that filled instantly with water, drowning equipment, swallowing men unlucky enough to fall inside. Advancing meant wading knee-deep, rifles held high, every step exhausting, every movement slowed. The enemy knew this and struck when soldiers were at their weakest, when speed was impossible. Losses were heavy, not always from bullets but from the land itself. And yet, even in autumn, there were reminders of life. The smell of wet earth after rain, the sight of geese flying overhead, the sound of leaves rustling before the wind tore them away. These small signs of change reminded soldiers of cycles beyond war, of seasons that had passed long before them and would continue after. Some spoke softly of harvests back home, of fields now tended by no one, of families who faced their own struggles without them. The weight of longing grew stronger, heavier than their packs, yet it was also what carried them onward. Autumn taught them patience, endurance in stillness, survival in waiting. It was a season of transition, a slow descent into another winter, and the men braced themselves, knowing the worst was yet to come, but refusing to let despair take hold before it arrived. Letters from home were among the few lifelines soldiers clung to on the Eastern Front. When the mail arrived, men gathered eagerly, eyes searching for their names, hands trembling as envelopes were passed down the line. Some received nothing for months, and the silence weighed heavier than any shelling. Those lucky enough to hold a letter unfolded it carefully, as though it might crumble in their hands. The paper smelled faintly of smoke or perfume, carrying with it a piece of another world. Words from a mother, a wife, or a child were read slowly, often aloud, shared with comrades who had no news of their own. Even the simplest sentences, "The garden is still growing," "The house stands," "We wait for you," brought strength. Yet just as often, letters carried sorrow. Reports of bombings, of villages destroyed, of hunger at home, pierced deeper than the cold. Some soldiers cried quietly in the dark after reading, turning away so others would not see. Others folded the paper neatly, tucking it into breast pockets where it stayed, worn thin by constant touch. In times of despair, men reached for these letters, tracing the handwriting with numb fingers, reminding themselves that they still had something to return to. For those who received no news, Imagination filled the silence. They wondered if their families were safe, if their homes still stood, if their names were remembered. This uncertainty could be worse than bad news, because it left the mind to wander endlessly. Comrades tried to comfort one another, offering hope when words from home were absent, but the silence remained a heavy burden. Writing letters back was no easier. Soldiers crouched in dim light, pencils dull, paper scarce. They struggled to find words that would not frighten their loved ones. They wrote of health even when ill, of warmth even when freezing, of food even when hungry. Truth was softened, reshaped into something bearable, because no man wanted to add to the suffering of those waiting at home. These letters became a strange performance. Lies told with love, words designed to protect rather than deceive. The ritual of writing itself brought comfort. Scratching out sentences on torn pages gave soldiers a sense of connection, a way to imagine they were still part of the lives they had left behind. Some included drawings, crude sketches of flowers, of houses, of birds, symbols of normal life preserved in fragile lines. Others sealed sprigs of grass or a button, tokens that carried more weight than paragraphs of text. Mail was slow, and letters often arrived months after being written, sometimes reaching families after the sender had already fallen. Still, men wrote, because the act itself mattered. It was proof of hope, of a future imagined, of ties that war could not sever. On nights when shells were distant, and the sky seemed calm, soldiers took out their letters, and read them again, lips moving silently, eyes lingering on familiar names. For a few minutes the war faded, and they were simply men thinking of home. Then the letters were folded once more, tucked back into pockets close to the heart, carried forward into another day of endurance. Comradeship was the invisible thread that held Soviet soldiers together on the Eastern Front. Without it, many would not have survived a single winter. Men learned quickly that endurance was not only about personal strength, but about leaning on one another when the weight grew too heavy. In the dugouts they shared everything: rations, blankets, cigarettes, even silence. A single crust of bread was broken into pieces so that no one went without, and the smallest flame of a match was passed carefully from hand to hand, lighting one cigarette, then another, until every man had a moment's relief. These gestures were simple, yet they built a bond stronger than orders or discipline. A soldier knew that the man beside him would not abandon him, and that knowledge was often the only shield against despair. When one faltered during a march, another offered a shoulder. When someone fell ill, comrades covered for him, working twice as hard so he could rest. The front demanded sacrifice, but among themselves, the soldiers created small pockets of humanity. They whispered jokes in the dark, sometimes so absurd that they laughed until their sides hurt, laughter muffled quickly, so it would not draw attention. In those brief moments they felt almost alive again, almost free. Stories were exchanged endlessly. Some told tales of villages and families, of wives and children waiting at home. Others spoke of dreams for after the war, of rebuilding houses, of planting fields, of simply sitting in peace without fear. These conversations painted pictures of a future they might never see, yet imagining it gave them strength to survive the present. Trust grew quietly, forged by nights spent back-to-back in trenches, by long marches endured side by side, by battles where survival depended on the man next to you holding firm. Soldiers rarely spoke of love or loyalty in grand terms, but they lived it through action. If one had a blanket, he shared it. If one had a piece of sausage, it was cut in half. If one collapsed in exhaustion, others carried him until he could stand again. The bond was not written in words, but in sweat, in hunger, in the quiet endurance of hardship together. Death was a constant companion, and when it came, the loss of a comrade cut deeper than any wound. Burials were often hurried, shallow graves marked with sticks or helmets. Still, men stood in silence, heads bowed, paying respect in the only way they could. They remembered the jokes, the shared bread, the long marches, and carried those memories forward, as though keeping the dead alive, through memory alone. Comradeship gave soldiers more than survival, it gave them meaning in a world stripped of it. In the darkest nights, when frost crept in, and fear pressed heavy, it was not ideology or command that kept them steady, but the presence of another man beside them, breathing, enduring, carrying the same weight. This bond, unspoken but unbreakable, became their true weapon against despair, their anchor through the endless struggle of the Eastern Front. Fear on the Eastern Front was constant, but it changed its shape depending on the moment. At night, it was the fear of sudden attack, the thought of enemy patrols moving silently through the darkness. Every rustle of branches, every shift of wind seemed louder, sharper, carrying possibility of danger. Soldiers lay awake, rifles within arm's reach, listening to the night as though it whispered threats. In the daylight, fear became more immediate. Artillery shells screamed overhead without warning, and men instinctively threw themselves to the ground, covering heads, waiting for the crash. The sound shook the earth, left ears ringing and filled the air with dirt and smoke. Even when the explosions were far away, the anticipation gnawed at nerves. The waiting between shell bursts was often worse than the noise itself. Fear also lived in the small spaces of daily routine. A soldier might fear lifting his boot from the mud, unsure if he could pull it free. He might fear drinking from a stream, uncertain if it carried disease. He might fear closing his eyes for even a few minutes, afraid he would not wake when needed. These were quiet fears, but they pressed as heavily as battle. Yet soldiers learned to live with fear, not by banishing it, but by carrying it like another piece of equipment. They joked about it, calling it a shadow that marched beside them. They mocked it in whispers, though each man knew how deeply it cut. Some grew silent, retreating inward, showing no sign of their dread. Others spoke openly, admitting tremors in their hands or the pounding of their hearts, and were not judged because everyone understood. Fear was universal, shared equally, an invisible companion no one could escape. Letters home rarely mentioned it. Families were told of strength, of courage, of determination, but not of the nights when hands shook so badly that a soldier could barely write his name. That truth stayed hidden, spoken only among comrades or kept locked in silence. And yet, strangely, fear also sharpened instincts. It made soldiers notice details others would miss. The faint smell of smoke that meant movement ahead, the sudden silence of birds that signaled danger. Fear became part of survival, as necessary as rifles or rations. Still, the weight of constant dread wore men down. Some developed thousand-yard stares, eyes fixed far away even in moments of calm. Others shook uncontrollably after battle, bodies unable to hide the toll. Yet each morning they rose, strapped on their gear, and stepped back into the uncertainty. For them, bravery was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite it. The Eastern Front taught them that courage was not grand or heroic, but quiet, persistent, and deeply human. It was the act of standing watch in the freezing dark, of marching when legs could no longer feel, of fighting when every instinct screamed to run. Fear never left them, but endurance grew stronger than fear, and that endurance became their true shield. Hunger was perhaps the most faithful companion of the Soviet soldier. Always present, always gnawing. Rations were rarely enough, and when supplies fell behind, men stretched what little they had with desperate creativity. A crust of bread was divided carefully, every crumb gathered so nothing was lost. Soup was thinned until it resembled little more than hot water, and soldiers drank it slowly, closing their eyes as though savoring a feast. Sometimes they found frozen potatoes or turnips, treasures buried in the soil, eaten raw despite the taste. Cigarettes were traded for food, buttons sewn with thread for an apple. Anything that could fill the stomach for even a moment. Hunger made men dream constantly of meals from home. They spoke endlessly of bread fresh from the oven, of butter melting on hot potatoes, of milk thick and sweet. Conversations turned to recipes, to smells and tastes long gone, and these memories both tortured and sustained them. Jokes were made that they could taste food by describing it, though the laughter was bitter. At times, soldiers foraged when orders allowed. Mushrooms in forests, berries along riversides, even nettles boiled into thin stews. Some roasted strips of horse meat when animals collapsed, though guilt lingered afterward. Desperation drove them further still. Leather boiled into broth, bark scraped from trees. It was survival stripped to its rawest form. And though their bodies weakened, their will endured. Hunger hollowed cheeks, sharpened bones, slowed movements. Men grew dizzy during marches, their legs trembling beneath them. Yet they continued, because orders gave no pause for weakness. Some fainted in fields, lifted by comrades, carried until strength returned. Death from starvation was not common compared to battle, but the constant ache wore away at spirit, making each task feel heavier. In letters home, hunger was rarely mentioned. Families already struggled with shortages, and soldiers did not wish to burden them further. Instead, they wrote of health, of imagined full meals, hiding the truth of their gnawing emptiness. Among comrades, hunger was spoken of openly, a shared misery that united them as strongly as fear or cold. A man who shared half his ration became a brother for life, a bond sealed not in words but in sacrifice. There were moments of strange triumph too. When supply wagons finally arrived, when tins of meat or sacks of flour were unloaded, the mood lifted instantly. Songs were sung, laughter echoed, spirits rose. For a brief time, bellies were full, and the world seemed almost bearable. But the relief never lasted long, and soon hunger returned, steady and familiar. It was a shadow that never left, a constant reminder that survival was not only about bullets or shells, but about enduring the emptiness inside. And so Soviet soldiers learned to live with it, carrying their hunger like another weapon, silent and heavy, but never strong enough to break their will to endure. Illness was another enemy on the Eastern Front, just as relentless as bullets or shells. The damp trenches bred coughs that spread like wildfire, and without medicine, even the smallest sickness became dangerous. A sore throat turned into fever, a cut festered into infection, and lice covered every body, biting until skin bled. Soldiers scratched constantly, sometimes tearing their flesh open, leaving marks that never healed. The itching was maddening, worse at night when men tried to rest, and yet there was no escape. Clothes could not be washed often, blankets rarely dried, and the lice multiplied endlessly. Fever left men shivering under thin coats, their comrades, placing hands on foreheads, whispering words of comfort, they could not back with medicine. There were no hospitals near the front, only makeshift aid stations, where wounded and sick lay side by side on the ground. The smell of blood, sweat, and illness mixed thick in the air, and doctors worked with little more than bandages and hope. Medicine was scarce, sometimes only iodine or alcohol, used sparingly, treasured as much as food. Morphine was a rare miracle, most often reserved for the dying. Soldiers learned to endure pain silently, to tie rags around wounds, to bite down on sticks when shrapnel was pulled from flesh. Amputations were done without proper tools, screams muffled by cloth stuffed into mouths. Comrades held each other down, whispering encouragement, promising survival, even when eyes already dimmed. Some men never returned to the line, taken away by carts or left behind when units moved on. Their absence was felt heavily, an empty space in the dugout, a silence at night, where once there had been a voice. Sickness claimed men quietly, without the thunder of artillery, and the loss felt somehow colder. It was a reminder that the war was fought not only against the enemy, but against the body itself. Still, resilience showed in small ways. Soldiers fashioned remedies from herbs, boiled pine needles for vitamin-rich tea, used garlic or onions when they could find them. They invented cures from memory, from stories told by mothers and grandmothers, clinging to any chance of relief. Hope was as vital as medicine, and comrades fed it to one another as carefully as they shared food. At night, coughing echoed in the dugouts, but so too did whispered songs, prayers, and promises. Men swore to survive, to endure together, even when their bodies betrayed them. Illness weakened them, but it could not erase their determination. They rose each morning, pale and trembling, yet still they carried rifles, still they marched, still they faced another day on the endless front. In their endurance was a quiet defiance, a refusal to yield to the sickness that stalked them as relentlessly as the enemy. The landscape of the Eastern Front shaped every step of a soldier's life. As much an enemy as the opposing army. Vast open fields stretched endlessly, offering no cover, no shelter, just flat expanses where every movement could be seen and targeted. Crossing them meant walking with hearts pounding, each step a gamble against the distant crack of rifles, or the sudden howl of artillery. Forests offered concealment, but carried their own dangers. Trees whispered in the wind, branches snapping under weight, every sound magnified in tense silence. Men moved carefully, eyes scanning shadows, knowing ambushes could lie in wait. At night, the forest became even more menacing, paths vanishing, roots twisting ankles, darkness pressing heavy on every side. Rivers were both lifelines and threats. In winter they froze, becoming highways of ice, but each crossing carried risk of collapse. Men marched single file, ears straining for the sound of cracking beneath boots, praying the ice would hold. In spring, rivers swelled with meltwater, currents fierce and unforgiving. Makeshift bridges swayed under weight, ropes stretched taut, and soldiers clung with trembling hands as they crossed. More than once men slipped, swept away before comrades could react. Villages dotted the land, most burned or abandoned, their ruins silent testimony to lives erased. Soldiers scavenged what they could. Wood for fires, nails for repairs, sometimes scraps of food hidden beneath floorboards. Yet even ruins felt dangerous, walls crumbling under weight, sharp edges catching clothes, memories haunting every corner. The smell of smoke lingered long after flames had died, a reminder of destruction that never seemed to end. Seasons changed, and with them the battlefield's cruelty. Winter froze the earth until shovels broke against it, while summer turned ground to dust that choked lungs. Spring brought floods of mud, swallowing boots and wagons, while autumn laid a carpet of wet leaves that hid traps and holes. No season was kind, no landscape forgiving. Even the skies offered little comfort. Planes droned above, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, always a reminder that death could descend without warning. Bombs tore open fields, leaving craters that filled with water, scars upon scars that reshaped the land. Soldiers learned to read the terrain like a second language, knowing which ridge offered cover, which ditch held water, which tree line was too dangerous to approach. Yet even knowledge could not always save them. The land was unpredictable, shifting with every season, every storm, every battle. Still, amid the harshness, beauty sometimes revealed itself. A sunrise painted in red and gold over snow, a quiet river reflecting stars, a meadow where wildflowers grew despite the scars of war. Soldiers noticed these moments, stored them away in memory, carried them like hidden treasures. The land was cruel, but it was also alive, and in its fleeting beauty, men found reminders of the world beyond war, reminders that gave them strength to endure one more march, one more night, one more day. The nights on the Eastern Front carried a weight that daylight could not match. Darkness spread across the land like a shroud, swallowing fields, forests, and trenches. until the world felt endless and empty. Fires were forbidden, for even the smallest glow risked drawing enemy fire, so soldiers huddled in the cold, guided only by starlight or the pale face of the moon. Silence pressed heavily, broken only by distant artillery or the occasional crack of a rifle shot. Every sound became sharper, every rustle in the grass a possible threat. Men stood watch with eyes straining into the dark, fingers tightening on rifles, hearts pounding with the fear of what might emerge. Sleep came in fragments. Soldiers curled on the ground, using coats as blankets, rifles close at hand. Dreams blurred with reality, filled with echoes of explosions, shouts, and footsteps. Many woke suddenly, gasping, unsure if the danger was real or imagined. Exhaustion made eyes heavy, but duty demanded alertness, and so they forced themselves awake, taking turns, trusting comrades to keep watch when their own strength faltered. The cold seemed sharper at night, creeping deeper into bones, making every joint ache. Breath clouded in the air, frost forming on collars, on the edges of helmets, on the wooden walls of dugouts. Some men whispered quietly to themselves, prayers or songs remembered from childhood, words carried into the dark as a fragile defense against despair. Others spoke in hushed tones with comrades, trading stories, sharing hopes, clinging to the sound of another human voice. Letters were often read at night, folded papers held close to small lanterns when risk allowed, words traced by fingers in the dark. Memories of home felt stronger then, when silence wrapped the world, and the mind could wander toward warmth and comfort. Some men carried keepsakes, photographs, locks of hair, charms, that they pressed to their chests, closing their eyes as though the objects might carry them home, even for a moment. The enemy haunted the nights as much as the cold. Raids were launched under cover of darkness, sudden bursts of chaos breaking the stillness. Alarm calls sent men scrambling from shallow sleep, rifles raised, hearts racing as they fired into shadows. Afterwards, silence returned even heavier, broken only by the moans of the wounded, or the echo of footsteps retreating. Trust in comrades grew deepest during these hours. Men leaned on each other, knowing that one man's failure to stay awake could doom them all. A hand placed on a shoulder, a whispered warning, a shared glance in the dark became bonds stronger than words. Through nights of fear and cold, it was this trust that kept them steady. And when dawn finally broke, casting pale light over the fields, the relief was immense. The rising sun did not end the war, but it ended another night of waiting, another night endured. For soldiers on the Eastern Front, every sunrise was proof they had survived the darkness once more. Weapons were more than tools of war for the Soviet soldier. They were lifelines, carried and cared for as carefully as one might guard food or letters from home. The rifle was never far, even in sleep, resting within arm's reach. Each man knew that without his weapons survival was impossible, and so they checked and rechecked bolts, wiped down barrels, and kept ammunition dry even when everything else was soaked. In winter, rifles froze, their metal so cold it burned skin, and soldiers warmed them with breath, or by pressing them against their bodies beneath coats. In spring, mud clogged barrels, demanding endless cleaning. Summer dust worked its way into every joint, while autumn rains rusted the smallest parts. Each season brought new threats to a weapon's reliability, and each demanded constant vigilance. Ammunition was precious, sometimes counted bullet by bullet, carried carefully in pouches, never wasted unless orders demanded. Men whispered warnings to one another in trenches: conserve, aim carefully, make each shot matter. The crack of a rifle echoed across fields, sharp and unmistakable, but just as heavy was the silence when a rifle failed to fire. In those moments life depended on comrades nearby. Machine guns and mortars added to their defense, but were heavy and cumbersome. Teams dragged them through mud, across rivers, over ruined fields, setting them in place only to move again hours later. Each round fired meant more weight to carry, more exhaustion in bodies already drained. Grenades were clutched tightly during raids, their weight both comfort and terror. Soldiers tied them to belts, fingers brushing them constantly, as reminders that they had at least one last defense if the enemy came too close. Yet weapons were not only instruments of destruction, but also symbols of trust. A comrade's rifle laid beside yours meant he would fight with you, that he would not abandon his post. In quiet moments, soldiers cleaned their weapons together, the sound of cloth against metal almost soothing, a ritual that steadied minds in chaos. Some even gave their rifles nicknames, speaking to them softly as if to companions, because in truth, they were. But not all weapons comforted. Some soldiers found themselves haunted by them, staring at bayonets stained from close combat, hands trembling at memories they could not erase. War demanded use, but the soul often recoiled, and many carried that weight silently. Still, each morning they rose, slung rifles over thin shoulders and marched forward, because to be without a weapon was to be without a chance. The bond between soldier and weapon was born of necessity, yet it carried something deeper, the acknowledgement that survival depended on care, on discipline, on constant readiness. In the endless struggle of the Eastern Front, weapons were not just tools of war, they were extensions of the men themselves, silent companions in the fight to endure. Clothing on the Eastern Front was both armor and torment. Soviet soldiers often marched in uniforms already worn thin, coats patched so many times that original fabric could barely be seen. In winter, layers were piled on, wool, cotton, whatever could be found. Yet still the cold pierced through, biting at skin, leaving fingers stiff and numb. Scarves were torn from blankets, socks made from strips of cloth, newspapers stuffed into boots to block the wind. Summer brought a different misery. Heavy coats became ovens, sweat pouring beneath fabric that clung to bodies, rubbing skin raw. Shirts grew stiff with salt, and the smell of unwashed men lingered heavy in the air. Flies buzzed constantly, drawn to sweat, crawling into sleeves and collars, until soldiers swatted in irritation, even while marching. In spring and autumn, dampness became the true enemy. Rain soaked through uniforms, coats grew heavy, boots filled with water. Men tried to dry clothes over small fires, but flames were rare, and smoke betrayed positions. Wet fabric rubbed against skin until sores opened, infection following close behind. Feet were the worst sufferers. Marches in wet boots left soldiers with blisters that burst, skin peeling, toenails blackening. Some men wrapped rags around their feet when socks ran out, but the cloth slipped, bunched, and caused more pain than relief. Frostbite in winter, rot in spring, burns in summer heat. There was no season when clothing gave peace, yet soldiers cared for what they had with desperate devotion. Needles and thread were traded like treasure. Men patched holes in one another's coats, shared socks, cut strips of cloth for bandages when nothing else was available. A good pair of boots was worth more than gold, guarded carefully, repaired again and again until leather split. Helmets dented in battle were hammered back into shape, straps replaced with rope, anything to keep them usable. Clothing became part of identity too, scarves knitted by mothers or wives, patches sewn with bits of fabric from home, even a button carved from wood. All carried meaning. These small touches reminded soldiers that they were more than uniforms, more than numbers. They were individuals, remembered and loved, and their clothing held those memories close. Still, the misery of discomfort was constant. Lice thrived in seams, biting until skin burned. Soldiers boiled clothes when possible, watching insects float to the surface, only for them to return days later. The battle against vermin was endless, as draining as any march. Yet through all of this, men endured, wearing the same coats through summers and winters, sleeping in damp socks, marching in boots long past their life. Each tear, each patch, each worn thread told the story of survival, of a soldier's determination to endure, despite the weight of hardship. Their uniforms may have been ragged, but within them beat hearts that refused to surrender. The march was one of the most grueling parts of life on the Eastern Front. A test of endurance that repeated endlessly. Soldiers walked for hours, sometimes days, carrying rifles, ammunition, and packs that felt heavier with every step. The road beneath them changed with the seasons, frozen and sharp in winter, sucking mud in spring, choking dust in summer, slick with wet leaves in autumn. Each step was a reminder of the weight pressing on their bodies. Feet blistered until skin tore, socks stiff with blood, boots worn thin until soles split. Yet still they moved forward, driven by orders and the rhythm of comrades around them. The column stretched long, men trudging in silence, breath steaming, eyes fixed on the back of the soldier ahead. Conversation was rare, energy too precious to waste on words. Now and then, a song might rise quietly, a folk tune hummed under breath, growing into a murmur that passed down the line, lifting spirits for a short while before fading again. Horses pulled wagons heavy with supplies, but when animals collapsed from exhaustion, soldiers took the load themselves, straining against harnesses, pulling wheels from deep ruts. No one complained, for complaint changed nothing, and silence felt easier than despair. Rest was scarce. At halts, men dropped where they stood, packs still on their shoulders, some closing eyes for a few stolen minutes of sleep, others chewing quickly on dry bread before the whistle blew again. Muscles ached constantly, backs bent under strain, yet bodies adapted, moving forward almost automatically, as though the march itself had become a kind of survival instinct. The landscape they crossed told silent stories. Burned villages with chimneys standing like gravestones, fields pocked with craters, forests scarred by shellfire. Now and then, they passed shallow graves, wooden markers leaning in the wind, reminders of those who had marched before and would never march again. The sight was sobering, yet it also hardened their resolve. Each man knew he might soon join those who had fallen, but until that moment came, his duty was to continue. Water was scarce on marches, and thirst burned as cruelly as hunger. Soldiers filled canteens from streams or puddles, the water muddy, sometimes bitter, but it was swallowed eagerly. Heat in summer made lips crack, tongues swell, while winter froze water solid in canteens, forcing men to chip at ice for a sip. Hunger followed closely too, stomachs gnawing as rations ran thin. Yet through pain, thirst, hunger, and exhaustion, soldiers carried on. To stop was impossible. To fall behind meant being lost. The march demanded everything from their bodies, but it also gave them something in return: unity. Each man's struggle was mirrored in the man beside him, and that shared endurance forged a bond as strong as steel. Together they moved step by step, through landscapes of silence and ruin, their persistence itself becoming an act of defiance against the vast cruelty of the front. Battle on the Eastern Front was rarely a single moment of chaos. It was a rhythm of noise and silence that repeated until men no longer knew which was worse. The shriek of incoming shells split the air without warning, a sound so sharp it seemed to cut through bone. Soldiers dropped instinctively, pressing faces into earth, gripping rifles as the ground shook beneath them. Explosions rained soil and snow over trenches, leaving the air thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Ears rang, vision blurred, and yet when silence fell again, the dread deepened. For every soldier knew it was only the pause before the next barrage. Machine guns rattled, their rhythm relentless, cutting across fields where men scrambled for cover. The ground was torn apart, craters opening like wounds, filled quickly with water, blood, or bodies. Orders shouted over the roar often vanished in the noise, leaving soldiers to act on instinct, moving forward when every nerve demanded retreat. Fear was constant, but training and comradeship carried men through, each trusting the man beside him to stand firm. In close combat, the battle became terrifyingly personal. Bayonets flashed in the smoke, shouts mingled with screams, and men fought not as armies but as individuals. face to face with enemies who were just as desperate to survive. These moments left scars deeper than any wound, memories that returned at night in restless dreams. After the fighting, silence lay heavy, almost unbearable. The battlefield was a sea of broken helmets, scattered rifles, and bodies that did not rise. Survivors moved among them, searching for comrades, calling names, listening for groans of the wounded. Some carried injured men back to trenches, dragging them through mud, whispering encouragement even when hope was thin. Others dug shallow graves, marking them with sticks, the ritual hurried but heartfelt. Grief was rarely spoken aloud, but it lingered in every glance, every silence, every bowed head. The smell of smoke clung to uniforms, mixed with the iron scent of blood, refusing to fade. Yet after every battle, orders came again. Trenches had to be repaired, defenses rebuilt, watches set. There was no time to mourn properly, no pause to recover. Soldiers learned to push grief aside, locking it deep within themselves, carrying it silently, as they carried their rifles. But within the silence of night, memories returned. Faces of the fallen hovered in the dark, voices of comrades echoed faintly, and men lay awake, staring at the roof of the dugout, unable to close their eyes. Courage on the Eastern Front was not a grand gesture, not banners or speeches. It was the quiet act of standing again after battle, of picking up a rifle once more, of walking forward into smoke and thunder knowing what awaited. It was persistence born not of choice, but of necessity, and it defined every soldier who endured. Rest on the Eastern Front was more illusion than reality. Soldiers spoke of sleep as though it were a luxury, something distant and rare, never truly satisfying. Dugouts were cramped, low spaces dug into earth, lined with wooden planks when possible, though most leaked in rain and froze in winter. Air was heavy with smoke from tiny stoves, the scent of damp clothes, and the sourness of too many bodies packed together. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, boots still on, rifles within reach, blankets too thin to fight the cold. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the cough of a comrade, the bark of orders, or the distant rumble of artillery. Dreams rarely brought comfort. Many relived battles in their minds, hearing shells burst, feeling the weight of fear pressing down even in slumber. Some woke shouting, hands grasping rifles before realizing no enemy was near. Others lay still, eyes open in the dark, too tired to sleep yet unable to close their minds. Exhaustion was constant, seeping into bones until even simple tasks felt monumental. Yet soldiers adapted, mastering the art of rest in moments. A man could fall asleep sitting upright, leaning against a trench wall, or lying in the mud during a short pause on a march. Sleep became survival, taken in whatever scraps could be found. When supplies allowed, straw was laid on dugout floors, a small mercy against frozen ground. Sometimes soldiers scavenged pillows from abandoned homes, a reminder of comfort long gone. Even a single candle lit in the darkness brought warmth to their hearts, the flame flickering against dirt walls, turning the space into something almost human. Conversations before sleep often became confessions. Men whispered of fears, of families, of hopes they dared not say in daylight. In those hours, when voices softened, and the outside world was hidden by earth and night, bonds deepened. Promises were made quietly, that they would survive together, that they would return home, that none would be forgotten. Yet dawn always came quickly. Orders echoed, boots shuffled, rifles were lifted once more. Rest ended as abruptly as it began, and men rose with heavy eyes, bodies aching, moving forward as though pulled by invisible strings. Fatigue became part of existence, endured as naturally as hunger or cold. Some grew so used to exhaustion that they forgot what true rest felt like, their bodies functioning on instinct alone. Still, even in this relentless cycle, soldiers clung to small rituals, a prayer before closing eyes, a song hummed softly, a letter read once more by candlelight. These gestures turned brief sleep into something more than physical relief. They became anchors of spirit. On the Eastern Front, rest was never enough, but even in fragments, it gave men the strength to face another endless day. The seasons shaped everything about survival, turning each month into a different kind of battle. Winter froze rifles solid, ice clinging to every surface, boots cracking with frost. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, breath turning to crystals that coated their collars. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes silently, without warning, until a man no longer felt his hands. Yet spring brought no relief, only rivers of mud that swallowed boots and wagons, slowing every step. The ground sucked at feet with each movement, and men pulled themselves forward as if dragging anchors. Horses collapsed, supply carts stuck fast, and the air grew heavy with dampness. Clothing never dried, and illness spread in the moisture. By summer, the same land became a furnace. The sun scorched fields, helmets burned under its weight, and dust filled mouths and lungs. Water became scarce, thirst burned hotter than hunger, and sickness spread through rivers fouled by too many crossings. Flies and mosquitoes swarmed, biting relentlessly, covering every wound, every scrap of food. Autumn shifted again, cool winds carrying the promise of frost, rain soaking every trench, turning roads into quagmires. Leaves fell, hiding holes and pits that twisted ankles, while mist crept across the fields, swallowing sight and sound. Every season carried its own misery, but also its strange beauty. In winter, snow muffled the battlefield, softening ruins under a white blanket that almost looked pure. In spring, buds appeared on trees, tiny green leaves pushing stubbornly through mud. Summer brought wildflowers that bloomed in fields scarred by shells, bright flashes of color against gray destruction. Autumn painted forests gold and crimson before stripping them bare, a final blaze of beauty before the return of cold. Soldiers noticed these things, even in their exhaustion. A sunrise reflected on ice, the sound of birds returning, the rustle of leaves before rain. These small details reminded them that life continued beyond war. They carried those images with them, speaking of them in dugouts, sharing them like treasures. The seasons tested their bodies endlessly, forcing them to adapt, to endure with little rest, little food, little comfort. But they also reminded them that change was constant. No winter lasted forever. No mud swallowed the world entirely. No summer sun burned without end. Each hardship passed, replaced by another, and in that cycle soldiers found a strange rhythm. They learned to survive not by expecting relief, but by expecting change. The seasons became both enemy and companion, marking time in a place where days blurred into one another. And as each cycle turned, the men turned with it, shaped by frost and mud, by heat and rain, carrying within them the quiet endurance of those who refused to yield, no matter what the land demanded. Silence on the Eastern Front was never simple. At times it came after hours of thunderous shelling, when the ground finally stilled, and the sky held no streaks of fire. Men lay in trenches, listening to the absence of noise, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding harder than the distant guns. This silence was heavy, filled with the memory of chaos, and the dread of its return. It felt unnatural, almost painful, as though the world itself was holding its breath. At other times silence came in the middle of night, broken only by the crackle of frost, or the distant howl of wolves. Soldiers on watch strained their ears, every small sound magnified, each rustle in the dark a threat. Eyes searched the horizon, nerves pulled taut, fingers tight around cold metal. The silence was alive then, charged with possibility, a thin veil that could be torn open by attack at any second. Yet silence could also be fragile, and strangely tender. In rare moments of calm, men sat together without speaking, sharing bread or passing a cigarette. The fire from a match glowed briefly before vanishing, leaving only the quiet of breath and the steady beat of hearts. Words were unnecessary in those moments. The silence itself carried meaning, a reminder that they were not alone. Letters from home were often read in silence too. Men unfolded worn pages slowly, tracing words with eyes, their lips moving without sound. Around them, comrades looked away, giving space for private memories. The dugout might be crowded, yet each man's silence formed a wall around him, a momentary return to another world. Silence could heal as much as it hurt. After long marches, when boots were pulled off, and bodies collapsed on damp ground, men closed their eyes and let silence wrap them. No words, no movement, just the simple relief of stillness. It gave the body strength again, even when the mind remained restless. But silence also brought memory. Without the distraction of gunfire or orders, thoughts crept in. Faces of those lost, villages left behind, families far away. Some men cried softly in the dark, others stared at nothing, carrying their grief in wordless solitude. No one mocked them, for everyone knew the silence belonged to all. The front was built on noise and fear, but it was the silences between that shaped soldiers most deeply. They learned to endure them, to find in them both terror and peace. A single night might contain every kind of silence, the dreadful, the watchful, the tender, and through each one, men discovered strength they had not known they possessed. On the Eastern Front, silence was never empty. It was filled with everything unsaid, everything endured, everything carried forward into the next day. Memories of home followed every soldier, sometimes comforting, sometimes unbearably heavy. In the cold of night, when wind whistled through broken trees and frost crept across dugout walls, men closed their eyes and thought of kitchens warm with fire, of fields golden in harvest, of voices calling them by name. These images were fragile shelters against the weight of war. A mother's smile, a wife's hands, a child's laughter. Such memories came suddenly, unbidden, and lingered long after eyes opened again to ruin. Comrades spoke of home often, trading stories like treasures. One described the river where he fished as a boy, another recalled the smell of bread baking, another spoke of songs sung at weddings. These fragments painted a world beyond the front, a world worth enduring for. Yet memories also carried pain. The longer the war dragged on, the more uncertain they became. Was the house still standing? Was the village burned? Were the family alive? Letters brought answers sometimes, but silence from home cut deeper than any wound. Imagination filled the gaps, and often it was cruel. A soldier would lie awake, haunted not by battle but by the unknown fate of those he loved. Keepsakes became anchors, a photograph tucked into a breast pocket, edges worn thin by constant touch. A scarf knitted by a sister, carried through mud and snow. A locket, a ribbon, even a small carved toy. Each object held more meaning than rifles or rations, because they reminded men of who they were beyond the uniform. Soldiers guarded them fiercely, wrapping them in cloth, showing them to trusted comrades, never letting them out of reach. These items survived marches, battles and seasons, carried like secret flames in a world of darkness. Memories were not only private, they were shared as well. In dugouts, when men whispered to each other, stories of home softened the edges of fear. Descriptions of orchards, of festivals, of evenings spent by rivers, gave comrades something to imagine, something that replaced the endless mud and smoke with color. Laughter sometimes rose, fragile but real, as men compared whose mother baked the best bread, whose village had the finest fields. In those moments, war felt distant, replaced by the ordinary joys of life remembered. Yet the sharpest pain came when a comrade fell. His stories ended abruptly, his memories silenced, leaving others to carry them forward. Soldiers sometimes repeated tales of the dead, as if speaking them aloud kept them alive. Memory became an act of defiance, a way to resist the erasure of lives swallowed by war. On the Eastern Front, where each day blurred into the next, memories gave meaning. They reminded soldiers of why they endured, of what waited beyond the trenches. They were both burden and blessing, both wound and healing, and so men carried them quietly, alongside hunger, fear, and exhaustion, holding on to the fragments of home as fiercely as they held their rifles. For in memory lived the hope of return. Music and song traveled with Soviet soldiers even in the harshest places, carried not by instruments but by voices. In moments of exhaustion, when marches dragged on endlessly, someone might begin to hum a folk tune, low at first, barely audible over the crunch of boots. Slowly others joined, the sound growing into a murmur that passed down the column. The songs were not about war but about home, about rivers, fields, and love left behind. They brought rhythm to weary steps, binding men together in harmony that rose above hunger and cold. Around campfires, when the risk was low, voices lifted stronger. One soldier might sing alone, the others listening in silence, eyes closed, the melody carrying them away from mud and frost. Sometimes entire dugouts joined, filling the dark with sound that reached beyond the earth walls. Echoing into the night, music reminded them that they were still human, not only soldiers. It softened the fear, even if only for a few minutes. Instruments were rare, but occasionally a harmonica appeared, traded or scavenged. Its thin notes cut through the air, fragile but bright. Men gathered close, smiling faintly, some tapping boots to the rhythm, others lost in thought. These small concerts became treasures, remembered for weeks afterward. The power of song was not only in melody, but in memory. A single verse could transport a man back to a summer evening in his village, to the sound of crickets, to laughter shared long before war. Some soldiers wept quietly, hiding their faces, but no one judged, for everyone felt the same ache. Music also served as strength in battle. Marching into danger, men sometimes sang loudly, voices defiant against the roar of guns. It steadied nerves, filled the emptiness between heartbeats, turned fear into determination. The enemy might fire, shells might fall, but the sound of song carried them forward, reminding each soldier he was part of something larger. In quieter times, songs became prayers. Softly spoken words to the sky, to the stars, to the memory of those lost. They carried hope, promises to return, dreams of life beyond the front. Even when voices cracked with fatigue, even when words faltered, the act of singing itself mattered. It meant they were still alive, still enduring, still connected to one another. Music, fragile and fleeting, outlasted even the strongest hardships. On nights when cold pressed hardest, when hunger bit deepest, a single melody could warm the spirit more than fire. It turned dugouts into homes, marches into journeys shared, and silence into something less heavy. For Soviet soldiers, song was not escape. It was survival, woven into every breath, every step, every night endured. Faith on the Eastern Front took many forms, quiet and deeply personal. Some soldiers carried small icons tucked into breast pockets, worn smooth from constant touch. Others whispered prayers under their breath before battle, crossing themselves quickly when no officer was watching. Faith was not always tied to church or ritual. Often it was simply belief in survival, in the possibility of seeing home again. Men spoke of fate, of destiny, of luck, trying to make sense of why one comrade fell while another endured. In dugouts at night, conversations sometimes turned to higher powers. A soldier might confess that he prayed for his family's safety, another that he begged forgiveness for what he had done in battle. These whispers were shared softly, the earth walls holding secrets that could not be spoken in daylight. For many, faith was not about victory, but about endurance. It was the strength to lift a rifle again, to march another mile, to rise after falling. Small rituals became sacred. A man kissed a medal before sleep, another tied a strip of cloth around his wrist as a charm. Superstitions flourished too, stepping with the right foot first, carrying a lucky coin, never speaking of survival aloud. These habits gave soldiers a sense of control, in a world where control had been stripped away. Nature often felt like proof of something greater. The rising sun after a long night, the sudden break of clouds revealing stars, the quiet fall of snowflakes, each carried meaning. Each was taken as a sign that life still held beauty. Some soldiers swore that birds flying overhead were omens, or that the sound of wind through trees was a voice guiding them. Whether true or imagined, these signs gave hope where reason could not. Faith was also found in comradeship. Trust in the man beside you, belief that he would not abandon you, became its own religion. Promises made in silence, "We will return together, we will not forget," were prayers as binding as any scripture. In the chaos of battle, soldiers shouted each other's names like invocations, pulling strength from the bond itself. Even those who claimed no belief at all carried fragments of faith. They placed it in their families, in the idea of future harvests, in the thought of rebuilding what had been lost. Faith was survival disguised as hope, and without it, despair would have consumed them entirely. On the Eastern Front, where death shadowed every step, faith became a quiet rebellion. It was not shouted, not preached, but lived in the smallest actions, in a hand gripping an icon, in lips moving silently under the stars, in the stubborn act of rising each morning despite everything. Loss was a constant presence on the Eastern Front, woven into every day like the cold or the hunger. Comrades who had marched together for months could vanish in a moment, taken by a shell, a bullet, or illness. The absence was immediate and sharp, an empty place in the trench, a voice missing from evening whispers, a silence where once there had been laughter. Soldiers rarely had time to grieve properly. The war allowed no pause, no space for mourning. Burials were hurried, shallow graves dug with numb hands, marked by a stick or a helmet placed carefully on the mound. A few words were spoken, often whispered, promises that the fallen would not be forgotten. Then the column moved on, leaving behind markers that blended into the endless landscape of loss. Yet even without ritual, grief lived deep in every soldier. At night, men remembered the faces of those gone, replaying shared jokes, shared bread, shared silence. Some carried small belongings of the dead, a cigarette case, a scarf, a photograph, to keep their memory alive. Others spoke their names aloud in dugouts, refusing to let them fade into the dark. Loss hardened soldiers but also bound them closer. Each death reminded the living how fragile survival was, how quickly fate could shift. Men leaned more heavily on those who remained, finding comfort in shared endurance. They promised to look after one another, to carry each other through, because each comrade lost deepened the value of those who still stood. The land itself became a graveyard. Fields, forests, and rivers held countless fallen, many without markers, their names known only to comrades who had seen them fall. Soldiers walked past these places daily, aware that beneath the soil lay thousands of stories cut short. Some whispered a prayer as they passed, others touched helmets briefly, acknowledging the unseen. Loss also carried fear, a reminder that each man's turn could come at any moment. Yet it carried defiance too. To survive another day became a way of honoring the dead, proof that their sacrifice was not in vain. The memory of comrades gave strength, whispering in the background of every march, every battle, every night endured. Letters home rarely mentioned these losses in detail. Families received notices, but soldiers chose silence, unwilling to describe the emptiness that followed. Instead, they carried grief within themselves, shouldering it as they did rifles, heavy, but unavoidable. On the Eastern Front, loss was not a single event but a constant companion. It shadowed every step, sat beside every soldier, lay in every trench. And yet, even in its weight, men endured, carrying the memories of the fallen forward, binding them into their own strength, refusing to let them be erased by silence or time. Endurance on the Eastern Front was never about a single moment of heroism, but about the countless small acts of survival repeated day after day. Soviet soldiers rose each morning in the face of hunger, cold, fear, and exhaustion, carrying rifles on tired shoulders and hope in weary hearts. They marched through snow, mud, dust, and rain, each season testing them differently, each demanding strength that seemed impossible to give, but was given anyway. They fought not only the enemy, but the land itself, a land that froze, drowned, and burned them in turn. And yet, they endured. They shared crusts of bread and sips of water, divided rations so no one went without, and gave their last dry socks or blanket to comrades weaker than themselves. These acts, small and quiet, built a brotherhood stronger than steel. In dugouts and trenches, they whispered stories of home, sang old songs, clutched keepsakes, and read letters until the paper wore thin. They laughed together in rare moments, cried silently in others, but always stood side by side when dawn came and orders called. The Eastern Front carved itself into their bodies and souls. Scars of frostbite, lines etched by exhaustion, memories that returned each night in restless dreams. Some carried physical wounds, others invisible ones, yet all bore the mark of endurance. Loss followed them constantly, comrades buried in shallow graves, names spoken softly so they would not be forgotten. And still, the survivors pressed forward, carrying the weight of the dead with them, making survival itself an act of remembrance. Faith, whether in God, in luck, or simply in the promise of home, kept them moving. Nature, cruel as it was, also gave them fleeting beauty, a sunrise over snow, wildflowers in summer, the sound of birds cutting through silence. These glimpses of life beyond war became fuel for the soul, proof that the world still held more than destruction. To endure was to believe, even quietly, that tomorrow might come, that the war might end, that return was possible. When the guns finally fell silent, and the front dissolved into memory, those who survived carried with them more than scars. They carried stories, etched deep, of comradeship, of loss, of hunger and frost, of laughter, in the darkest nights. They carried the memory of millions who did not return, whose voices were silenced, but whose presence remained in every step forward. The Eastern Front was a place of unimaginable suffering, but also of resilience. It showed the capacity of ordinary men to withstand extraordinary hardship, to find strength not in glory but in survival. Theirs was not a story of triumph in the usual sense, but of endurance itself, the quiet victory of refusing to collapse under the weight of despair. In the end, what Soviet soldiers endured was more than war. It was a test of the human spirit, and their persistence, their will to live, remains one of the starkest reminders of what people can survive when survival is all that remains.